Have you ever noticed that when you're anxious, your heart races, your breathing becomes shallow, your muscles tense? Now think about sexual excitement. A racing heart, shallow breathing, muscle tension. The physical sensations are exactly the same. So why does anxiety sometimes completely shut down sexual arousal, while other times it can actually make sexual experiences feel even more exciting? In today's episode, we're exploring the fascinating relationship between anxiety and sexual arousal and how your brain determines whether those same physical sensations are experienced as fear or excitement. Hello, and welcome to Ask a Sex Therapist, a space where we explore sexuality, intimacy, relationships, and sexual well being with curiosity, compassion, and evidence based understanding. I'm Justine Gilliland, a sex therapist and counselor, and in today's episode, we're exploring the question: can anxiety affect sexual arousal? The relationship between anxiety and sexual arousal is not as simple as it first appears. At times, anxiety can be an instant mood killer, suffocating arousal. Other times, anxiety can even fuel and enhance arousal. In this episode, we'll explore why. To understand the relationship between anxiety and sexual arousal, we first need to explore how they show up in the body. The physical sensations of anxiety and sexual arousal in the body are exactly the same. The physical sensations of anxiety include a racing heart, shallow breathing, blood pumping, sweating, increased muscle tension, and the physical sensations of sexual arousal, exactly the same. Both anxiety and sexual arousal also involve the release of adrenaline, which gives the body a burst of energy, resulting in that racing heart and increased muscle tension. While the physical sensations are exactly the same, one feels exciting, while the other one can feel fear inducing. So, if the physical sensations are the same, how does the brain differentiate the feeling of anxiety from arousal? A key difference is that while the physical sensations are identical and both involve the release of adrenaline, anxiety also releases cortisol, commonly known as the stress hormone. But hormones are only part of the story. The brain also interprets these physical sensations based on meaning and context. Here's how it plays out. How does the brain determine whether to feel sexually aroused or anxious? Step 1. The cue. First, there is a cue, which could be internal or external. Internal cues might include a thought, fantasy, emotion, or physical sensations internally. External cues could include something you see, hear, smell, or physically touch. This cue is then processed by the emotional center of the brain, followed by the thinking center of the brain. Step 2. Survival first processing. The brain operates survival first. It is always trying to keep us alive and safe from threat. Before we are even consciously aware, in our emotional center of the brain, our brain's threat detection system has already lightning fast evaluated the cue. This part of our brain, deep within our emotional center, is constantly scanning for immediate threats. This is an unconscious and automatic process. If the brain's threat system is activated, the typical response is anxiety. When the threat system is activated, both cortisol and adrenaline are released. While adrenaline is also present during sexual arousal, cortisol is a long-acting stress hormone that traps the body in a state of high alert, prioritizing survival and generally shutting down the relaxation required for genital response. How the body responds to adrenaline also matters. Although adrenaline is present during sexual arousal, it paradoxically plays a role in constricting the blood vessels of the genitals. In sexual arousal, adrenaline provides that sense of excitement, but at the same time, the brain must send signals to the nerves of the genitals to open the blood vessels and allow blood to flow in. During anxiety, the brain doesn't send these on signals. Instead, adrenaline is free to constrict the genital blood vessels, keeping blood away from the genitals. This helps explain experiences such as reduced genital pleasure or the loss of an erection during performance anxiety. Step 3. Emotional processing. Next, the cue is processed within what I like to call the brain's emotional center's one ring. The one ring acts like a master switchboard managing our emotional experiences. 3 specific functions help differentiate emotional experiences: learning, liking, and wanting. The learning function is based on past experiences and learned associations. The brain has linked certain cues with sexual pleasure and other cues with fear. The liking function asks, does this feel good or bad? In a safe context where the threat system has not been activated, an elevated heart rate is registered as pleasant. The wanting function is the accelerator of the emotional brain. It drives motivation to behave according to the emotion. If the brain perceives threat, the learning system associates the cue with fear. The liking system registers it as unpleasant. The wanting system then motivates avoidance or escape. However, if the brain perceives no threat, the learning system associates the cue with sexual pleasure. The liking system registers it as pleasant. The wanting system then motivates the pursuit of pleasurable stimulation. Next, the cue is processed by the thinking brain. Step 4. Thoughts and interpretation. The thinking part of the brain consciously evaluates the situation. So what happens if the brain has determined you are safe? If the thinking brain detects a cue that it determines to be sexually relevant and the threat system is quiet, sexual meaning is assigned to the physical sensation. Rather than anxiety, the brain says, this is sexually exciting. But what happens if the brain has determined you are being threatened? If the threat system has been activated and the one ring is motivating avoidance, the thinking brain attempts to make sense of the intense physical tension. Instead of assigning sexual meaning, it assigns an anxious meaning to your racing heart. For example, I'm going to fail, or this hurts. The thinking brain shifts into frantic problem solving or spectatoring, pulling you out of your body and into a mode where you're watching yourself rather than experiencing the moment. And this almost guarantees that sexual arousal cannot take hold. Context is highly involved in the brain's ability to both unconsciously and consciously make meaning out of a situation. For example, a beating heart after a romantic dinner with your partner may be interpreted as highly arousing. The very same beating heart experienced alone in a dark alleyway may be interpreted as fear. While anxiety is often thought of as an arousal killer, the reality is that the relationship between anxiety and sexual arousal is far more complex. Given the overlap between the physical sensations of anxiety and sexual arousal, the two can sometimes become tangled together. In fact, anxiety can even become a fuel for sexual arousal. This brings us to 2 fascinating concepts: the misattribution of arousal and excitation transfer. If there is ambiguity about the meaning of a cue, or there is a strong sexual cue in the midst of an anxious situation, the brain can misattribute anxiety as sexual arousal or determine the cue to be sexual. Rather than feeling anxious, a person may feel aroused instead. This is known as the misattribution of arousal. One of the classic demonstrations of this is known as the bridge study. In this study, men walked across a swaying suspension bridge, which naturally produced physical symptoms such as a racing heart. At the end of the bridge was an attractive female researcher. The men misattributed their racing hearts as sexual attraction rather than fear. The physical sensations were real. What differed was the meaning the brain assigned to those sensations. This then can lead to excitation transfer. Excitation transfer refers to how the body takes the brain's misattribution and uses that anxious energy to physically fuel sexual arousal. The physical arousal of anxiety, such as shallow breathing and a racing heart, transfers directly into sexual arousal because the two experiences share the same physical symptoms. As the body is already physically activated by anxiety, the transfer into sexual arousal can feel even more intense than if sexual arousal had emerged from a calm or neutral baseline. Excitation transfer doesn't only happen with anxiety, it can also occur with other forms of heightened physical activation. For example, after exercise, where the body is already activated, pumping blood, heart racing, this can transfer into heightened sexual arousal. During periods of amplified stress, the nervous system is already highly activated. Some people may seek orgasm as a way to release that built up tension. Over time, the brain can become so efficient at using this stress energy that heightened sexual interest develops primarily during periods of intense personal stress. Excitation transfer can also help explain why sexual arousal sometimes peaks when there is an element of risk or taboo. While there may be emotions such as guilt or fear, excitation transfer rapidly converts that physical activation into sexual fuel, contributing to feelings of liberation, thrill, celebration, and passion. The timing of anxiety matters. When anxiety emerges, also makes a difference to the experience of sexual arousal. If anxiety is present before a sexual cue, the anxiety and the cortisol released act as a sexual brake, diverting blood away from the genitals. For example, feeling worried about sexual performance or anticipating sexual pain before sexual activity even begins can actively suppress sexual arousal. If anxiety emerges suddenly during sexual arousal or intimacy, this can also act as a sexual brake. For example, during sexual activity, you may suddenly become distracted by work worries. That shift in attention is likely to diminish sexual arousal. However, when anxiety is present at the same time as emerging sexual arousal, this is where the two forms of physical arousal can interact and heighten sexual arousal. For example, imagine a couple sneaking away during a busy family holiday, hoping not to get caught. There is anxiety, but there is also sexual attraction. The resulting sexual arousal may feel even more exciting and intense. Again, this is another example of excitation transfer. The intensity of anxiety matters. The intensity of anxiety also makes a difference to the experience of sexual arousal. Low to moderate anxiety, when paired with sexual arousal, tends to amplify the experience of sexual arousal. By contrast, severe anxiety generally shuts arousal down, constricting the genitals and drawing blood away to prioritize survival. It is important to understand, however, that while this is the typical response, there is also the paradox of arousal non-concordance, where genital responsiveness can occur even without mental arousal. Arousal non-concordance is when there is a mismatch between mental arousal and genital arousal. Genital arousal can occur as a localized physical reflex through the lower spinal cord. This reflex operates independently of the brain's emotional state or permission. What this means is that even if the brain is sending shutdown signals, genital stimulation can still produce lubrication or an erection, even an orgasm. The brain may completely shut down sexually while the genitals automatically respond to physical stimulation. Examples include survivors of sexual assault who do not consent to sexual activity, yet experience genital responsiveness as a reflex to touch. The body's response is not a reflection of consent and should never be taken as a signal of consent. Furthermore, extreme anxiety can sometimes trigger genital responses even without physical touch. When the body is highly stressed, bursts of emotion produce massive surges of adrenaline that get the blood pumping. The brain, in a state of extreme anxiety, simultaneously fires up the sympathetic nervous system in what is almost like an electrical storm. The sheer magnitude of this electrical surge can overwhelm the brain's inhibitory controls and have a spillover effect to the genitals. The sympathetic nerve fibers responsible for the fight or flight response travel directly through the same pelvic nerve networks that control the genitals. Normally, some sympathetic nervous system activation is needed for genital arousal to allow blood flow. However, heightened sympathetic activation, such as during anxiety, constricts the genitals and diverts blood away to prioritize survival. With a sudden surge of activation, the system can effectively short circuit. The overactivation can accidentally crossfire into the body's arousal pathways. This electrical misfire overrides the usual shutdown response and accidentally activates the parasympathetic nerves that open the local blood vessels of the pelvis and genitals. At the same time, the massive surge of adrenaline is already pumping blood forcefully from the heart, directing that blood into these newly opened vessels. An example is the experience of an erection during an argument, or a veteran with PTSD experiencing spontaneous erections during moments of heightened stress. These responses are completely involuntary. Then there's the other matter of anxiety, depression, or stress fueling sexual activity. While anxiety, depression, and stress typically act as sexual breaks, some people notice the opposite. Instead of shutting down sexual interest, they experience a desperate urge towards sex. In these instances, sex is no longer primarily about desire. Sex becomes a primary emotion regulation strategy. This occurs for approximately 10 to 20% of people, where interest in sex feels like an urge whenever negative mood states are experienced. Rather than deactivating the sexual accelerator is activated during the fight or flight response to relieve overwhelming emotional tension. The primary motivation is no longer pleasure, it is a desperation for relief. This process is known as emotional sexualization. Emotional sexualization describes the funneling of non-sexual emotions into a sexual impulse in order to relieve them. The raw physiological tension is channeled into an urgent craving for sexual activity to numb emotional pain. This behavior is then reinforced over and over again because orgasm provides temporary reward and relief. The sexual relief temporarily switches off the distress. Over time, this can become compulsive. The brain has learned to automatically command sex whenever the individual feels overwhelmed. Understanding this process can be incredibly freeing. Rather than asking, why do I only want sex when I'm stressed? The question becomes, what has my brain learnt sex does for me? That shift moves us away from shame and towards curiosity. So, how can sex therapy help? Sex therapy can help you better understand the unique relationship between anxiety and your experience of sexual arousal. Rather than assuming anxiety is simply something to eliminate, together we explore how your brain has learned to interpret different situations, what activates your sexual accelerators and brakes, and how thoughts, emotions, beliefs, and past experiences influence your sexual response. For some individuals, the work involves reducing performance anxiety, fear, or pain, or catastrophic thinking that is suppressing arousal. For others, it is about understanding how stress, excitement, or risk have become intertwined with sexual arousal and whether these patterns continue to serve them. We may also explore relationship dynamics, communication, emotional safety, and the broader context in which sexual intimacy occurs. Sex therapy is not simply about improving sexual function. It is about understanding how your mind, body, and relationships work together to shape your unique experience of sexuality. I offer online sex therapy across Australia, supporting individuals and couples experiencing concerns related to anxiety, desire, arousal, intimacy, sexual functioning, and overall sexual well-being. Thank you for listening to Ask a Sex Therapist. This podcast is a space where I'll be exploring common questions and themes that arise in my work around sexuality, intimacy, relationships, and sexual well-being. Topics that many people quietly struggle with, but rarely talk about openly. If you'd like to learn more, explore related blogs, or inquire about online sex therapy across Australia, you can visit my website at wellbeingcounsellor.com.au. You can also subscribe for future conversations about sexuality, intimacy, relationships, and emotional well-being.